So the question here is, do I think single-player story-driven games are making a comeback at companies like Valve, or is it multiplayer? So I'm not going to speak for Valve. I have no idea what they're doing or working on. But this is always an interesting question to me, because if you're a studio the size of Valve, you have hundreds of people working there, it's really hard to make enough money and justify a single-player game these days when you could do a multiplayer game. Now, I know you're going to point to the handful of single-player games that have made an absolute ton of money recently. That is awesome. But the long tail that you will see on a game is insane of a good multiplayer game and how long it could go. Left 4 Dead, for example, it made tons of dollars every year for years after it came out. I don't want to say a number. I had a number head because me and Carrie used to joke about it. But and at that point, it would just be like me and Carrie working on that for like 10 years with like the only people on it. And it still made that money. It didn't need anything more because the multiplayer itself brought that forward in the community making mods. Where if you make a single player game, you got to put a lot more into it, a lot more upfront, and you have a bigger bet. I mean, what if it fails? What if it doesn't hit, right? And then where are you? And so that's why you see bigger game companies tend to make multiplayer games because of that long tail. And man, if they take that bet and they hit, and they make that big successful game, they're talking billion-dollar franchises, right? Multi-billions of dollars versus just, doing a couple $100 million. I know, just a couple $100 million, but this is the scale we're talking about. But the interesting thing for me that I've been thinking about lately is I think this leaves a place for smaller developers to explore and do single-player stuff. And do single-player stuff that we've already seen a lot of. Like, I've seen a lot of retro kind of like Doom-style shooters recently that are just single-player. And I think that's interesting. And I think, again, I talk about Tom Clancy Wildlands a lot as one of my favorite games. Could you pull that off with a really small team now and just do something? And not quite as ambitious as that, but something of its own kind of flavor and feel and own thing. But then what's your interesting hook, right? Because if you're a small studio, you tend to have something that really makes your game stand out, makes it really different. You can't just say, oh no, if you cried before, you're really going to cry in this game. Now, solo devs can do that often, right? Because, again, your scale is so small that you sell tens of thousands of units and you're happy. But once you get a studio going, my studio, we were blowing through a lot of money. We had a lot of senior people, and salaries have come down. But it's still true that, you have 10 people, roughly say if they're senior developers with healthcare and everything else, you're a couple $100,000 a year. That means, what is 10 people? That's like $2 million, right? And then all of a sudden, your scale, what you have to do has to be bigger, and you want to take a bigger shot because, hey, that's why you're doing it. But I really have hope that there would be more single-player stuff, and I think about that a lot now, and I think about maybe for the next thing, kind of exploring that in a different way. Yeah. I mean, because I still play that, especially, I will say this. There's a dollar amount I look at when I look at and I go, hey, not dollar, not exactly, but you know what I'm saying. Like, there's like, hey, this is like a 15-minute game. I'm not going to pay you $30 for it. But if a 2-hour game, that's a sweet spot for me. Like $2 or 2 hours, $20. That's a fair deal to me. And so it's like, I think you can do smaller stuff at a smaller studio that is that 2-hour game, and that'll actually make your game more popular because it's not trying to hold up for like the 40 hours or something that a big single player AAA game has to do. And so I think that opens it up for like the 2 to 4 hour length. I mean, I guess the question for people is, how would you feel for a game that was 2 to 4 hours long and you spent maybe $10 or $20 on it? Is that fair? Do you, like, if it was really good, if you're like, oh man, that was really good, that really got me. Because then you could try a bunch, right? Like, and that's why I do. That's why I do the what are you playing this weekend? Because it's like, what's the quick little easy thing? What's the small little thing that experiment and try? Not what's the thing that I'm going to spend the rest of my life on. And like, I like to find those games and I like to play those games, and I think some of those games find a lot of popularity because they are smaller. I don't know, maybe. I'm interested to see what people think about that. Because it's weird always to say some dollar amount and some hours, and that's why I fumbled with that, because I don't really think of it that way. But there is something about a point where shorter games have more value to me than a longer game. If that makes sense?